join professional organizations and unions on equal terms. Black workers were systematically excluded from professional organizations and labor unions that could have advanced their careers. While unions fought for workers' rights, many locals maintained whites-only membership policies or created separate auxiliary chapters for black workers with no real power. This meant black employees missed out on networking opportunities, professional development, collective bargaining power, and the connections that led to better positions. The exclusion extended beyond just membership. Even in integrated unions, black workers rarely held leadership positions or had their concerns prioritized during contract negotiations. This created a dual system where white workers could organize for better conditions, while black workers remained isolated and vulnerable. The few integrated unions that existed often faced internal tensions, with white members resisting efforts to address racial pay gaps or discriminatory hiring. For black professionals in fields like teaching or medicine, being shut out of professional associations meant limited access to continuing education, certification opportunities, and the informal knowledge sharing that advanced careers. The impact was profound. Without union protection, black workers faced arbitrary firings, had no recourse for grievances, and couldn't collectively bargain for wages that matched their white counterparts doing identical work. Receive equal pay for equal work. The wage gap between black and white workers doing identical jobs was staggering and entirely legal. Black workers routinely earned 50 to 70% of what their white colleagues made, even when performing the same tasks with the same experience and qualifications. Employers justified this through elaborate but transparent fictions, calling the same job by different titles, claiming black workers were in training indefinitely, or simply stating outright that different wages applied to different races. A black factory worker might operate the same machine, meet the same quotas, and work the same hours as a white coworker, yet take home substantially less at week's end. This wasn't limited to manual labor. Black teachers with identical credentials and experience earned less than white teachers in the same districts. Black nurses, clerks, and technicians all faced systematic pay discrimination. The financial impact compounded over lifetimes, affecting everything from home ownership to retirement savings to what families could provide for their children. Some employers added insult to injury by paying black workers in cash to avoid paper trails, making it harder to prove discrimination or claim benefits. The practice was so normalized that job advertisements openly listed different wage scales by race. Fighting back meant risking termination, and with few legal protections, most black workers had no choice but to accept wages that didn't reflect the value of their labor. Use the same break rooms and facilities. Workplace segregation extended to every corner of the building. Black workers were directed to separate break rooms, often poorly maintained spaces tucked in basements or back corners. These rooms had inferior furniture, inadequate heating or cooling, and sometimes lacked basic amenities like coffee makers or refrigerators that white break rooms provided. Restrooms were similarly segregated, with colored facilities often in worse condition, broken fixtures, poor lighting, inadequate supplies. Some workplaces only provided outdoor facilities for black workers, regardless of weather. Water fountains bore the familiar white and colored signs, with the black fountain typically older, with lukewarm water and chipped porcelain. Lunchrooms were divided, sometimes with physical barriers, other times with invisible but rigidly enforced social boundaries. Black workers who accidentally entered white spaces faced immediate confrontation, threats, or dismissal. The psychological impact of these daily humiliations wore on workers who contributed equally to their employer's success, but were told through every spatial arrangement that they were lesser. For black workers in hospitals, the irony was especially bitter. They might care for white patients but couldn't use the same cafeteria as white staff. In factories, black and white workers might stand side by side on the assembly line but were forbidden from sitting together during breaks. The message was clear and constant, separate and unequal. Advanced to supervisory or management positions. An invisible but impenetrable ceiling blocked black workers from advancement. Companies maintained explicit policies limiting black employees to certain job categories, typically the lowest paid and least desirable positions. A black worker could have superior skills, more experience, and better performance reviews than white colleagues, yet promotions went to less qualified white workers every time. When questioned, management offered transparent excuses. White customers wouldn't accept black supervisors, white workers wouldn't take direction from black bosses. The position required skills black workers supposedly lacked. In reality, the barrier was pure racial hierarchy. Some industries developed elaborate job classification systems specifically to maintain segregation, with certain titles reserved exclusively for whites, regardless of who actually performed the work. Black workers watched as newly hired white employees with no experience rapidly advanced past them. The few black supervisors that existed typically only supervised other black workers in segregated departments. This meant black workers had almost no pathway to manage management, professional development, or the higher wages and respect that came with advancement. Talented individuals saw their potential wasted, their ambitions thwarted by a system designed to keep them subordinate. The impact extended beyond individual careers. It meant Black communities lacked the economic mobility and middle-class stability that management positions provided, perpetuating cycles of poverty across generations. Enter through the main entrance. Many workplaces forced Black employees to use separate entrances, typically in back alleys or side doors. White workers walked through the front entrance, often grand and welcoming, while Black workers were directed to service entrances, loading docks, or back stairwells. This wasn't about convenience. It was about marking Black workers as inferior from the moment they arrived. Department stores had Black employees enter through delivery areas, restaurants had them come through kitchen doors, offices assigned them basement or rear entrances. The practice served multiple purposes. It kept Black workers invisible to white customers and clients. It reinforced the social hierarchy daily, and it reminded Black workers of their subordinate status. Some buildings had such convoluted routes that Black workers had to arrive earlier just to navigate to their workstations. The symbolism was intentional and brutal. You may work here, but you don't belong here. During cold winters or rainy weather, white workers entered through sheltered, heated entrances, while Black workers trudged through unsheltered back routes. The indignity of it ate at workers who arrived early, worked hard and did quality work, yet weren't deemed worthy of walking through the same door. For Black professionals, teachers, nurses, clerks, the humiliation was especially acute, as their education and skills meant nothing compared to their race. Apply for jobs beyond designated categories. Help wanted ads explicitly stated race requirements, white only, colored need not apply, or separate listings for white and colored positions. Black workers weren't legally allowed to apply for most jobs regardless of their qualifications. Newspapers ran dual columns, one for white applicants with professional, clerical, and skilled positions, another for colored applicants listing only domestic, janitorial, and manual labor jobs. A Black worker with a college degree couldn't apply for office positions. A skilled Black carpenter couldn't apply for construction jobs listed for whites. Employment agencies maintained separate files and would refuse to submit Black applicants for white positions, even when qualifications matched. Some companies stated baldly in their applications that certain positions were not available to Negroes. This legal occupational segregation trapped Black workers in the lowest paying, least secure, most physically demanding jobs. Talented individuals saw opportunities posted daily that their skills perfectly matched, yet the door was legally closed to them. The frustration of watching less qualified white workers hired for positions you could excel at simply because of race created a special kind of helplessness. Young Black people planning careers had to consider not what they were capable of, but what they were allowed to do. The system ensured that Black workers remained concentrated in vulnerable positions with no job security, no benefits, and no future. Receive the same training as white coworkers. When Black workers were hired, they typically received minimal or no training compared to white employees. Companies invested in developing white workers through formal training programs, mentorship, and skill development, viewing them as long-term investments. Black workers were thrown into jobs with basic instructions and expected to figure it out, since management assumed they wouldn't advance anyway. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. With inadequate training, Black workers might struggle initially, which management then used to justify both the lack of training and the refusal to promote them. Apprenticeship programs, the traditional pathway to skilled trades, were almost entirely closed to Black workers. Unions that controlled access to apprenticeships in fields like plumbing, electrical work, and carpentry maintained whites-only policies. The few Black apprentices accepted faced hostile environments designed to push them out. In hospitals, Black nurses might receive training only for tasks with Black patients. In offices, Black workers were trained on outdated equipment or systems, while white workers learned current technology. This training gap meant Black workers couldn't develop the skills needed for advancement, even when opportunities theoretically existed. It also meant Black workers were more vulnerable to replacement. With minimal training investment, employers viewed them as easily substitutable. The denial of training was both a practical barrier to advancement and a symbolic statement that Black workers weren't worth investing in. Take breaks at the same time as white workers. Break schedules were staggered by race to maintain segregation and reinforce hierarchy. Black workers took breaks before or after white workers, often during less desirable times. If white workers broke during the comfortable mid-morning period, Black workers might break during the early morning cold or mid-afternoon heat. This wasn't random scheduling, it was deliberate separation. Lunch periods followed the same pattern, with Black workers assigned different times to prevent integration in break rooms or cafeterias. The staggered system created practical hardships. Black workers couldn't coordinate transportation, couldn't eat with friends, couldn't participate in workplace socializing that happened during breaks. It also sent a clear message about status. White workers' comfort and preferences took priority in every aspect of work life. In some workplaces, black workers had shorter break periods. Though this was rarely written policy, just understood practice. Supervisors would tolerate white workers lingering, but would write up black workers for taking an extra minute. The isolation of separate break times meant black workers missed informal networking, the casual conversations where information about opportunities circulated, the relationship building that led to better positions. It was another way the system ensured black workers remained separate, subordinate, and without access to the social capital that advanced careers. Participate in company social events and gatherings. Company picnics, holiday parties, retirement celebrations, and team-building events were white-only affairs. Black workers were simply not invited, or if the company made a token gesture toward integration, separate events were held. This exclusion from workplace social life had serious professional consequences beyond hurt feelings. Social events were where relationships deepened, where management got to know workers as individuals, where informal mentoring happened, where people learned about upcoming opportunities. Black workers were cut off from all of this. They couldn't network with decision-makers in casual settings, couldn't demonstrate their personalities and potential outside formal work contexts, couldn't build the relationships that led to recommendations and promotions. The message was clear: you're here to work, not to be part of the workplace community. Some companies held their social events at venues that excluded black people, using this as justification for not inviting black employees. Others simply stated that integrated social events would be uncomfortable for white workers and their families. Black workers contributed to the company's success, but couldn't celebrate it alongside their colleagues. They bought gifts for co-workers' weddings and babies, but weren't invited to the celebrations. The exclusion reinforced that black workers were outsiders, temporarily tolerated for their labor, but never truly part of the organization. Eat in the same cafeterias or lunchrooms as white workers. Workplace cafeterias maintained strict segregation, with separate seating areas, separate serving lines, or entirely separate dining facilities. In large workplaces like factories or hospitals, this might mean separate cafeterias in different buildings. In smaller settings, it meant designated tables or sections. Black workers couldn't sit wherever they wanted. Specific areas were marked for their use, typically the least desirable spaces with poor lighting, uncomfortable seating, or less access to amenities. Some cafeterias served black workers through a separate window, often offering different, inferior food options. The quality difference was noticeable. White workers might have hot meals with multiple choices, while black workers got basic, often cold options. Pricing was sometimes different too, with black workers paying the same or more for lesser food. Lunch periods became daily reminders of second-class status. Black workers ate separately from colleagues they worked alongside all day, unable to share meals, unable to participate in the social bonding of communal eating. In hospitals, the irony was especially sharp. Black cafeteria workers who prepared and served food to white staff couldn't eat in those same cafeterias. The segregated meal space was one of the most visible daily manifestations of workplace discrimination, a recurring humiliation that happened every single workday. Accessed the same medical facilities as white workers. Company clinics, first aid stations, and occupational health services were segregated. Black workers who were injured on the job might be refused treatment at the workplace medical facility and instead directed to distant colored hospitals or clinics. This delay in treatment could turn minor injuries into serious complications. Some companies maintained separate medical facilities for black workers, inevitably inferior in equipment, supplies, and staffing. Black workers might wait longer for care, receive less thorough treatment, and have their injuries taken less seriously. In factories with dangerous conditions, this inequality could be deadly. Industrial accidents required immediate expert care, yet black workers faced barriers even in emergencies. Some workplace ambulances would only transport white workers. The medical segregation extended to health insurance and benefits. When companies offered health plans, coverage for black workers was often limited or non-existent. Black workers with occupational illnesses faced additional discrimination, as company doctors were less likely to recognize workplace causation for black workers' health problems, denying them compensation. The message was brutally clear: your health and safety matter less because of your race. Black workers took on dangerous jobs that white workers rejected, faced the same or greater risk of injury, but couldn't access the same care when hurt. Challenge discriminatory treatment without retaliation. Black workers had virtually no recourse when facing discrimination. Complaining to management about unequal treatment, unfair discipline, or harassment meant immediate retaliation, termination, demotion, or being blacklisted within the industry. The few legal protections that existed were rarely enforced, and black workers knew that speaking up meant losing their livelihoods. This created a system of enforced silence where injustices accumulated with no outlet for grievance. If a black worker was passed over for promotion, paid less than white co-workers, or subjected to racial slurs by supervisors, objecting typically resulted in being fired for insubordination or attitude problems. Management relied on this fear to maintain the discriminatory system. Black workers who tried to organize faced even worse retaliation, not just firing, but violence, police harassment, and blacklisting that prevented them from finding work anywhere in their community. Some industries maintained informal networks to identify troublemakers, ensuring that black workers who challenged discrimination couldn't find employment elsewhere. This atmosphere of fear and powerlessness was deliberate. It kept black workers docile, accepting injustices because the alternative was unemployment and destitution. The inability to advocate for fair treatment without risking everything created psychological stress on top of the daily indignities, as workers swallowed frustrations and humiliations to keep their jobs. Use the same locker rooms in changing facilities. Locker rooms were segregated, with black workers assigned to inferior spaces. In factories, warehouses, and hospitals where workers needed to change clothes, separate facilities maintained the color line. White workers had well-maintained locker rooms with adequate lighting, heating, secure lockers, and proper facilities. Black workers got cramped, poorly maintained spaces, sometimes without working locks, adequate ventilation, or private changing areas. In some workplaces, black workers had no locker room at all and had to change in restrooms or storage areas. Female black workers faced particular hardship, as their segregated facilities were often afterthoughts with inadequate privacy. The quality difference in these personal spaces sent a daily message about worth and belonging. Beyond the discomfort and indignity, the separate facilities reinforced social segregation. The locker room was another space where workplace bonds formed, where workers talked and connected, where the human side of work life happened. Black workers were excluded from this too. The practical implications were also significant. Inadequate or distant changing facilities meant black workers spent extra unpaid time getting ready for work, and the lack of secure storage meant they couldn't safely keep personal belongings. Every high aspect of the work experience, even the most basic personal needs, was marked by inequality. Receive fair discipline and evaluation. Black workers faced harsher discipline for the same infractions as white workers. A white employee might receive a verbal warning for arriving late, while a black worker was written up or suspended for the same behavior. This double standard permeated workplace discipline. Black workers were held to stricter attendance standards, given less leeway for mistakes, and punished more severely for violations. Performance evaluations were similarly biased, with black workers receiving lower ratings despite equal or superior performance. Supervisors used subjective criteria, attitude, fit, potential, to justify lower evaluations for black workers, denying them raises and promotions. The evaluations often contained coded language about black workers being lazy, unreliable, or unsuited for advancement, regardless of their actual work record. This created an impossible situation where black workers had to be exceptional just to be considered adequate, while white workers with mediocre performance advanced steadily. The unfair discipline system served multiple purposes. It kept black workers in fear, it justified paying them less and not promoting them, and it maintained a paper trail that could be used to fire them at will. Black workers learned to be hypervigilant, knowing that any mistake could be weaponized against them in ways that didn't apply to white colleagues. The psychological burden of this constant scrutiny, combined with watching white workers face no consequences for similar or worse behavior, created a profoundly unjust work environment. Access job security and benefits. Black workers were typically hired as temporary, seasonal, or at-will employees even when performing permanent full-time work. This denial of job security meant black workers could be fired without cause, without notice, and without recourse. Companies used temporary classifications to avoid providing benefits. No health insurance, no retirement plans, no paid vacation, no sick leave. Black workers doing the same jobs as white employees received none of the benefits that made work sustainable and dignified. When economic downturns hit, black workers were fired first under last hired. First fired policies that companies claimed were race neutral, but were designed to and did disproportionately harm black workers. Seniority. Systems that might have protected workers were manipulated. When departments integrated, black workers' previous experience wasn't counted, making them forever junior to white workers hired after them. The lack of job security kept black workers in perpetual anxiety, unable to plan for the future, unable to take out mortgages or make investments that required stable employment. Benefits that white white workers took for granted, pensions, health coverage, paid time off, were denied to black workers who often needed them more due to lower wages and worse working conditions. The deliberate denial of security and benefits ensured black workers remained economically vulnerable, unable to build the stability that led to middle-class status and generational wealth. Work in clean, safe conditions. Black workers were disproportionately assigned to the most dangerous, dirtiest, and physically demanding jobs. In factories, they worked near toxic chemicals without adequate protective equipment, operated the most dangerous machinery, and handled the heaviest materials. In hospitals, black workers did the dirtiest cleaning work and handled contaminated materials. In construction, they got the most hazardous assignments. This wasn't random. Companies deliberately assigned dangerous work to black employees while giving safer positions to white workers. The rationale was both economic and racist. Black workers were paid less, so giving them dangerous work saved money, and their lives were valued less, so their safety was a lower priority. Workplace safety standards, minimal as they were, applied even less to black workers. Protective equipment might not be provided, safety training was cursory, and hazardous conditions black workers complained about were ignored. Injury rates among black workers were substantially higher, yet companies faced no consequences for this disparity. Black workers in industries like meatpacking, steel production, and chemical manufacturing faced horrific conditions, extreme temperatures, toxic exposures, crushing and cutting hazards, all for lower pay than white workers in safer positions. The deliberate exposure of black workers to workplace hazards amounted to a slow-motion violence, trading black lives and health for profit, while facing no accountability for the human cost. Have their skills and experience recognized. Black workers' qualifications were systematically dismissed and devalued. A black worker with years of experience was treated as less skilled than a white beginner. College degrees earned by black workers were ignored or deemed inferior regardless of the institution. Technical skills black workers demonstrated daily were attributed to luck or natural ability rather than learned expertise. This devaluation served to justify lower pay and blocked advancement. If a black worker's skills supposedly weren't real, then they didn't deserve better positions or compensation. The dismissal of black expertise was particularly galling in situations where black workers trained white employees who then became their supervisors. Black workers might have decades of experience and deep knowledge of processes and systems, yet their input was ignored in favor of less experienced white workers. In technical and professional fields, black workers faced constant assumptions of incompetence. Black teachers were assumed to be less educated, black nurses less skilled, black technicians less knowledgeable. They had to constantly prove basic competence, while white workers were given the benefit of the doubt. This undermined not just career advancement, but daily work life, as black workers' professional judgment was questioned and overridden. The message that your skills, experience, and knowledge don't count created deep frustration and anger, especially when black workers could see their expertise being appropriated by white colleagues who got credit for knowledge they learned from black workers. Interact with white customers or clients. Black workers were kept invisible from white customers and clients through deliberate segregation of customer-facing roles. Regardless of qualifications, black workers were denied positions that involved direct interaction with white clientele. In department stores, black workers stocked shelves and cleaned but couldn't work sales floors or cash registers where they'd interact with white shoppers. In banks, black workers couldn't be tellers. In offices, they couldn't be receptionists. The justification was that white customers wouldn't accept service from black workers, a presumption companies accommodated rather than challenged. This restriction cut black workers off from entire categories of jobs: sales, customer service, reception, client relations, that offered better pay, more visibility, and paths to advancement. Behind-the-scenes work, no matter how skilled, didn't lead anywhere. The segregation also meant black customers couldn't be served by black workers in many establishments, forcing them to interact with white employees who were often hostile or dismissive. For black professionals, the barrier was especially frustrating. Black doctors couldn't treat white patients. Black lawyers couldn't represent white clients. Black teachers couldn't teach white students. This artificial limitation on black workers' client base reduced their earning potential and career prospects while denying their communities access to black professionals. The restriction reinforced the notion that black workers were unsuitable for respectable, public-facing work, keeping them relegated to invisible support roles. speak up in meetings, or offer ideas. Black workers were expected to remain silent in workplace meetings and decision-making processes. When meetings were held to discuss work processes, solve problems, or plan projects, black workers either weren't invited or were expected to observe silently. If a black worker did speak up with a suggestion or idea, they were ignored, talked over, or criticized for overstepping. This silencing served multiple purposes. It reinforced the hierarchy by making clear that black workers' thoughts and ideas had no value. It prevented black workers from demonstrating their capabilities and knowledge in ways that might lead to advancement, and it ensured that workplace improvements continued to prioritize white workers' needs and perspectives. Black workers watched white colleagues voice the same ideas they'd had and receive praise and credit. They saw problems they could solve but weren't allowed to address. They had insights from their experience that could improve processes, but no venue to share them. This systematic exclusion from workplace discourse infantilized black workers, treating them as incapable of meaningful contribution beyond physical labor. For educated black workers, the enforced silence was especially demeaning, as their training and knowledge went unutilized. The prohibition on black workers' voices in workplace discussions ensured that workplaces were designed by and for white workers, with black workers' needs, safety, and efficiency never considered because they were never allowed to speak. Be treated as human beings, deserving of dignity and respect. The fundamental injustice underlying every other restriction was the denial of basic human dignity. Black workers weren't just discriminated against in specific ways. They were subjected to a comprehensive system designed to remind them constantly that they were considered inferior. This manifested in daily interactions where white supervisors addressed black workers with racial slurs, refused to use courtesy titles like Mr. or Mrs., and spoke to adult black workers as if they were children. Black workers endured being yelled at, cursed at, and publicly humiliated in ways no white worker would tolerate. The disrespect extended beyond words. Black workers' time wasn't valued, so they were kept waiting while white workers were promptly assisted. Their comfort didn't matter, so they worked in worse conditions. Their safety was expendable. Their expertise was dismissed. Their potential was denied. This systematic dehumanization was the point. The purpose wasn't just economic exploitation, but the psychological subjugation of maintaining black workers in a permanent state of subordination. Black workers had to swallow daily indignities, smile through disrespect, and accept treatment that denied their humanity, all while maintaining professionalism and productivity. The trauma of this systematic disrespect accumulates across years and generations. What made this the most significant barrier was that it underpinned all the others. Until black workers were seen as fully human and deserving of dignity, no other reform was possible. The fight for workplace equality was fundamentally a fight for recognition of black workers' humanity, their right to respect, to fair treatment, to basic human dignity in the workplace and beyond. Bus segregation. You couldn't sit just anywhere on the bus. You remember that, don't you? The front rows were reserved, white only. If you were black, you sat in the back, and even then, you'd better stand up if a white passenger needed your seat. The seats weren't just divided by a line. They were divided by centuries of arrogance and fear. The air was thick with the hum of the engine and the silent calculation of dignity versus safety. You didn't argue. You just moved, even when it burned your pride. Now, you hop on a bus today, sit where you like, scroll through your phone, and think nothing of it. But back then, every step toward that front seat could get you arrested. Or worse, can you imagine how heavy those simple rides felt? Water fountains. You couldn't drink from the same water fountain. And it wasn't just about thirst. It was about humiliation. The white fountain was cool, chrome, and spotless. The colored one, usually off to the side, was old, chipped, maybe barely working. It didn't just say, "You can't drink here." It said, "You are less." The sting wasn't in the water. It was in the sign. Today, when you grab a drink from a public dispenser or refill your bottle at the airport, do you ever think about how many people fought just to take a sip from the same tap as everyone else? Restaurants. You couldn't eat in certain restaurants. If you were traveling through the South in the 1960s, you had to plan your meals carefully. You carried food from home or relied on the Negro Motorist Green Book to find safe places to stop. Because most diners, even the ones that smelled like heaven with fried chicken and coffee brewing, would refuse you at the door. You might see the sign, "Whites Only," swinging gently in the wind above a neon-lit entrance. And even if hunger gnawed at you, you knew better than to walk in. If you dared to sit down at that counter, you'd face sneers, insults, maybe fists, and yet some did. Some sat anyway, quiet, steady, unshaken, knowing that their presence alone was an act of defiance. Think about that next time you order food from anywhere. No second thought about who's allowed to serve or sit beside you. Public parks and beaches. You couldn't take your children to every park or swim at every beach. Cities maintained separate recreation areas, white playgrounds with new swings and clean sand, and colored ones tucked in forgotten corners, with rusted slides and broken benches. Even water wasn't equal. Some beaches were patrolled by local police who made sure the line stayed clear. A rope in the water, sometimes invisible, sometimes enforced by men with batons, said you belonged only on one side. Imagine the sound of the waves, so free, so wide, and being told they weren't for you. Now, when you watch families gather under the sun without a second thought, you can't help but remember that there was a time when the ocean itself felt segregated. Movie theaters. You couldn't sit where you wanted in the theater either. In many southern towns, African Americans were sent upstairs to the balcony, what they called the colored section. You could hear the laughter, smell the popcorn, and feel the cool air from below, but you weren't part of that world. Sometimes you had your own entrance, a narrow stairway on the side of the building so you didn't pass through the main doors. The seats were older, the view wasn't as clear, but you still went, because escaping into a movie, even from up there, gave you a few hours where color lines blurred in the dark. Now you can walk into any cinema, sit where you please, lose yourself in the story. But back then, the story outside the screen was always the same. You were reminded of your place before the opening credits even began. Libraries and education. You couldn't use the same libraries or the same books. Some cities had entirely separate library systems. In others, you could only enter on certain days or check out books that white readers no longer wanted. Children would walk miles to small, underfunded colored schools, often sharing one textbook among several students. Pages torn, covers faded, but you studied anyway. You read by lamplight. You learned from hand-me-downs because knowledge wasn't just power, it was hope. And today, when you see a child tapping away on a school tablet surrounded by books and free Wi-Fi, you can almost feel the echo of what your parents and grandparents must have dreamed of, a world where learning didn't come with a locked door. Voting rights. You couldn't always vote, even though you were a citizen. On paper, the 15th Amendment said you could, but in practice, they made sure you couldn't. You remember the tests, don't you? Literacy tests that had nothing to do with reading and everything to do with humiliation. How many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Name all 67 judges in the state. If you stumbled, if you hesitated, they'd stamp denied across your name. Then there were the poll taxes. Small sums for some, impossible for others. You'd save pennies from your paycheck, only to watch the registrar tear up your application anyway. And yet, people kept trying. They stood in lines that stretched around courthouses, in the heat, in the rain, in the shadow of men with rifles, just to cast a single vote. Now you walk into a polling station and slide your ballot into a machine in seconds. But in the 60s, that act was a battle cry. Every X marked on paper was an act of courage. Hotels and travel. You couldn't stay just anywhere when you traveled. Hotels, motels, even gas stations had their unspoken rules. No coloreds, no Negroes. The Green Book wasn't a luxury. It was survival. You carried it in your glove compartment, thumbed through its worn pages, praying to find a safe bed for your family before nightfall. Picture this: the hum of the highway beneath your tires, the kids in the backseat asking when you'll stop, and the sinking feeling when you see another vacancy sign flicker off as you pull up. You'd sleep in the car sometimes, doors locked, a blanket across your lap, because even rest was segregated. Now you check into a hotel with a few taps on your phone, greeted with smiles at the front desk. But for many, that simple comfort was once a forbidden dream. Hospitals and healthcare. You couldn't be treated at every hospital. Many white hospitals refused to admit black patients, no matter how sick they were. In emergencies, you'd be turned away at the door, told to try the colored hospital down the road, even if that meant losing precious minutes. And when you got there, supplies were short, equipment outdated, and doctors overworked. Mothers gave birth in crowded wards. Children recovered in rooms without air conditioning. Even blood transfusions were segregated. They labeled vials by race. Think about that, segregating life itself. Now you walk into an emergency room and expect care, no questions asked. But back then, survival depended on your zip code and the color of your skin. Job opportunities. You couldn't apply for many of the jobs you qualified for. Employers would take one look at you, one glance at your address, and say, "We'll call you," but they never did. Factory work, sales positions, even clerical jobs, doors closed quietly, and when you did find work, you were paid less for doing the same labor. Some towns even had white job listings in the newspapers. Black workers were kept to janitorial or field labor, no matter their education. Yet you showed up every morning, pressed your shirt, did the work, because dignity didn't depend on permission. It came from endurance. Today, job applications are online. Names are typed, not spoken. Bias still lingers, but the walls aren't as visible. Still, can you feel how heavy it must have been to walk into an interview knowing the outcome before you even sat down? Clothing stores. You couldn't try on clothes in certain stores. Imagine walking into a shop, running your fingers over a new dress or suit only to be told you can't put that on. They said it was about hygiene, but you knew better. It was about control. You could buy it if you had the money, but you couldn't test the fit. So you'd hold the fabric up to your shoulder, estimate in the mirror, and hope it looked right once you got home. There was a quiet shame in that, but also defiance, because you were still claiming space in a world that wanted you invisible. Now you see fitting rooms lined up, mirrors bright, clerks smiling at everyone the same way. But back then, even fashion carried the sting of segregation. Swimming pools. You couldn't swim in most public pools. Some cities drained the pools completely when integration was ordered, just so white families wouldn't have to share the water. Imagine that, choosing to destroy something rather than share it. In many neighborhoods, the colored pools were smaller, old, or non-existent. You'd swim in rivers or creeks instead, places that carried both freedom and danger. But those moments, kids splashing, mothers laughing, were acts of rebellion. Joy became its own protest. Now, community pools are just another summer stop. But when you close your eyes and listen to the sound of water today, remember, once it echoed with the weight of exclusion. Public restrooms. You couldn't use every restroom. Traveling across the South, you'd see those signs again. White and colored. The white bathrooms were cool and clean. The colored ones, if they existed at all, were usually behind the building or in disrepair. For Black women especially, that humiliation was relentless. To be denied basic human needs, to hold it in while watching others walk freely in and out, it was a small cruelty repeated 1,000 times a day. Now, public restrooms are everywhere, shared by all. But every door that swings open today carries the memory of those that once stayed shut. Churches, you couldn't worship everywhere. Even the house of God was segregated. Some churches outright banned Black congregants. Others created separate entrances or designated pews in the back. But faith doesn't bow to barriers. So Black communities built their own churches, places that became more than sanctuaries. They were schools, meeting halls, headquarters for the movement. When the world refused your humanity, the church reminded you of it. Now, when gospel choirs and church bells ring across all colors and congregations, you can feel the echo of those who refused to let segregation reach their souls. Amusement parks and fairs. You couldn't enjoy the same rides or attractions. White-only parks posted guards at the gates. For Black families, that meant watching laughter and music from beyond the fence. Some parks had colored days, usually once a year, an insult wrapped in charity. So you made your own joy. You built your own carnivals, your own fairs, your own spaces where children could run free. Joy became a declaration. We exist, we feel, we celebrate. Now think about the ease of buying a ticket to Disney or Six Flags without fear. The laughter is the same, but the freedom behind it was paid for. Marriage and relationships. You couldn't marry freely, not if the person you loved was white. In many states, interracial marriage was illegal until 1967, when the Supreme Court finally struck those laws down in Loving v. Virginia. But before that, loving someone across color lines could mean arrest, exile, or violence. Black and white couples lived like fugitives in their own country, sneaking away to other states to say their vows, knowing their union wouldn't be recognized back home. Families were torn apart, communities whispered, and lawmen made examples of them. Now, love is still not always met with acceptance, but at least it's legal everywhere. You can hold the hand of the person you love in public without fearing the sheriff's car pulling up beside you. But for those who lived before 1967, love itself was a rebellion. Neighborhoods and housing. You couldn't buy or rent just anywhere. Realtors, banks, and city zoning laws worked together to keep Black families out of white neighborhoods. They called it redlining. Entire maps were drawn with red borders, marking the areas where banks wouldn't lend to Black buyers. Even when you had the money, you were told, "This house just sold," or "We're not taking new tenants." If you did move in, harassment followed. Slashed tires, broken windows, or worse. The American dream had boundaries that didn't appear on paper, but you could feel them every time you tried to cross. Now, neighborhoods are more mixed, but the echoes of those maps still shape where opportunity lives. Every time you see a house with a "for sale" sign, remember those who couldn't even get their foot in the door. Schools and integration. You couldn't send your child to every school. Even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the reality of integration moved at a snail's pace. In the early 60s, many southern states openly defied the ruling. Some shut down public schools entirely rather than allow Black and white students to learn side by side. So you saw brave children, just kids, walking through mobs, escorted by soldiers, books clutched to their chests. They faced screams, spit, and thrown stones just to sit in a classroom. Think about that. that. They were children asking for nothing more radical than an education. Now kids ride the same buses, share classrooms, and complain about homework together. But it's because those before them walked through fear so others could walk through open doors. Police and justice. You couldn't expect fair treatment from the law. The badge didn't mean safety. It meant danger. A routine stop could end in jail or worse. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't reach for your pocket. You didn't even run if you were innocent. Because in the eyes of the system, your innocence didn't matter. The jails were full of people charged with disturbing the peace or loitering, crimes invented to remind you that your freedom was conditional. Even black veterans returning from war, men who had fought for the country, were beaten for wearing their uniforms in the wrong town. Now the conversations about justice still echo, but at least the law can be challenged, recorded, exposed. Back then, silence was your only witness. Voting juries and civic duty. You couldn't serve on juries, even though verdicts affected your life. All white juries decided cases involving black defendants, and the outcome was almost always the same. Guilty. It wasn't justice, it was performance. Your civic duty was stripped away before it even began. You paid taxes, worked, lived by the law, but the law didn't see you as part of it. You were a subject, not a citizen. And yet the fight for inclusion didn't stop. Black lawyers, activists, and organizers filed lawsuits, built coalitions, and forced the country to confront its hypocrisy. Now, jury duty might feel like a chore to some, but to those who remember that era, being called to serve means something sacred. It means you finally have a voice in the system that once shut you out. Barbershops and beauty salons. You couldn't go to every barbershop or salon. The white-owned ones refused to cut black hair, claiming they weren't trained for that texture. It wasn't just about grooming, it was about dignity. So black entrepreneurs built their own spaces, and those spaces became community sanctuaries. A haircut wasn't just a service, it was connection, laughter, advice, debates about politics and sports, and the soothing buzz of the clippers. It all lived there. Black barbershops and beauty parlors weren't just businesses, they were survival centers. Now, you see stylists of every background learning to work with every texture, but the pride that came from creating your own space? That's the part that never changed. Public transportation beyond buses. You couldn't ride trains or airplanes the same way either. On trains, the colored car was always near the back, hotter, dirtier, noisier. Dining cars often refused black passengers altogether, forcing them to bring food from home. Air travel was worse. Many airports in the South had segregated waiting areas and bathrooms. Some airlines quietly denied black passengers boarding if seats were overbooked, always choosing to bump them first. Flying, that symbol of freedom, was just another reminder of limitation. Now, when you pass through airport security, boarding pass in hand, think about those who were grounded long before the plane even left the runway. Public pools and country clubs. You couldn't join most country clubs, swim teams, or golf courses. Leisure wasn't considered your right. If you wanted to play, you built your own. Black golf leagues, community centers, small private clubs made from nothing but willpower and a patch of land. Even tennis courts were contested ground. Players like Arthur Ashe broke through barriers not just with skill, but with composure under open hostility. His victories weren't just athletic, they were political. Now, when you see athletes of every color playing side by side, it's easy to forget how recent those locked gates were. But every open clubhouse today stands on the shoulders of those who built their own when no one would let them in. Military service. You couldn't serve equally in the armed forces. Though integration officially began in 1948, discrimination lingered well into the 60s. Black soldiers were given the hardest, most dangerous assignments. Promotions came slowly, if at all. In some bases, even the mess halls were still divided by race. And when they came home, medals on their chest, honor in their stride, they couldn't eat in the same restaurants as the white men they fought beside. Think about that. To defend freedom abroad, only to be denied it at home. Now, the military is one of the most integrated institutions in America, but every salute, every uniform today still carries the memory of those who saluted equality before the nation did. Shopping and department stores. You couldn't walk freely in the big department stores downtown. Even when your money was good, your presence wasn't welcome. Security guards followed you through aisles, clerks ignored you, dressing rooms were off limits, and restrooms were marked for white ladies only. So black shoppers learned to navigate the insult. Polite smiles, quiet dignity, eyes straight ahead. You bought what you needed, but never forgot the sting behind the transaction. The act of spending your own money became an act of quiet protest. Now everyone strolls through malls and stores without thinking twice. But for those who lived through it, consumer freedom came wrapped in the memory of exclusion. Workplace segregation. You couldn't rise in the rank. Even in industries that hired black workers, promotions had ceilings. The boss might say, "You're a good worker, but this position isn't for you." White employees with less experience were given titles, while you were told to be grateful. So you worked twice as hard for half the recognition, not because you were accepted, but because you had something to prove to yourself, to your children, to history. Now, corporations boast diversity programs, but the fight for equal opportunity began with those who refused to be silent in the face of invisible walls. Every office today stands on their shoulders. Sports and public games. You couldn't play on the same teams or even in the same stadiums. Colored leagues and white leagues divided athletes by race, no matter their talent. Black players weren't allowed into the major leagues, country clubs, or Olympic training camps, but they played anyway, on dusty fields and backlots, on cracked asphalt courts. And when one of them, Jackie Robinson, Wilma Rudolph, Muhammad Ali, broke through, it was more than victory. It was vindication. Now stadiums roar with unity. Jerseys are sold across the world, and every child, no matter their color, dreams of greatness. But that dream was built on decades of closed doors and stubborn persistence. Freedom of movement. You couldn't simply wander. Police had the power to stop you, question you, demand to know why you were out of your area. Sundown towns made it clear, if you were black, you'd better be gone before dark. So every drive, every stroll after work carried calculation. Which streets were safe? Which towns would look the other way? You learned to move with purpose, never lingering, never assuming safety. Now, freedom of movement is taken for granted. You walk where you please, day or night. But the memory of those curfews still lingers in the quiet corners of America. Everyday dignity. And maybe that was the cruelest part. You couldn't exist freely. You couldn't laugh too loud in the wrong place or challenge a white person's word. You couldn't forget yourself, not even for a sec. Dignity itself was a daily act of resistance. Every handshake, every church service, every bus ride, it all carried risk. And yet, people didn't just survive. They thrived, they loved, they built, they sang, they prayed, and they passed down stories of how they kept their humanity intact when everything around them tried to take it away. Now, when you look around at what's possible, the open schools, the shared neighborhoods, the laughter in public parks, you realize something simple but profound. None of it was inevitable. It was earned. Music and nightlife. You couldn't dance where you wanted to, not in the clubs where the bandstand gleamed under the soft gold of stage lights. In most towns, the music belonged to white patrons, and even when the sound was born from black rhythm and pain, you weren't welcome on the dance floor. In the 1960s, black musicians could headline a white club, but after the last song, they had to leave through the back door. You could be the one making the crowd move, the sax wailing, the bass trembling through the wooden floor, but you couldn't sit down at the bar for a drink. In many southern towns, even the local mixed dance halls had clear codes. Black patrons on weeknights, whites on weekends. The jukeboxes, too, told their own truth. In white diners, they'd remove race records, claiming they were too raw. Today, when you step into a cafe, plug your phone into a Bluetooth speaker, and play whatever song you love, it's hard to imagine that there was a time when sound itself was segregated. Back then, a black artist could be the soul of America's music and still be denied entry to the very spaces their art transformed. Do you ever think about how many songs were written in rooms that wouldn't have let the singer sit down? Movies and entertainment. You couldn't watch a movie just anywhere. Theaters were split down the middle, or worse, stacked. White patrons got the main floor. Black patrons were sent up to the balcony. They called it the Peanut Gallery, a name that stung as much as it mocked. The smell of buttered popcorn drifted up, but the view wasn't the same. You had to crane your neck, looking past the heads of others to see the screen below. Even the stories on that screen didn't belong to you. Hollywood in the 1960s was still painting the world in white, keeping black faces to the margins or making them caricatures. Sidney Poitier was one of the few who broke through. Graceful, dignified, but always carrying the burden of representing an entire people. Now we sit on equal seats, side by side in the dark, and streaming lets every story find its voice. But back then, watching a movie wasn't about escape. It was about endurance. You paid for a ticket just like anyone else, but you were still reminded, frame by frame, that this world wasn't built for you. Do you remember the first time you saw someone who looked like you on screen and didn't feel invisible? Public transportation. You couldn't travel freely, even when you had the ticket. Trains had separate cars. Buses had dividing lines that weren't just painted, they were enforced. In southern stations, white and colored waiting rooms meant you couldn't sit with your own family if your skin was the wrong shade. Imagine standing on a platform under the beating sun, holding your child's hand, knowing the cooler waiting area beyond the glass was off limits. You heard the laughter of passengers inside, the hiss of steam, and you felt the weight of being told, yet again, to wait your turn. The insult wasn't just in the inconvenience. Yes, it was in the daily erosion of dignity. Today, trains hum quietly across the country, and you can board without a second thought. But back then, every trip required calculation. What route was safe? What towns to avoid? Who might stop you? You weren't traveling for leisure. You were moving through a map of danger. Can you imagine planning a simple trip and needing courage just to sit down? Religion and church life. You couldn't even worship together. On Sundays, when church bells rang through small southern towns, they rang for two congregations divided by color. The white church stood on Main Street, proud and tall. The black church sat farther off, maybe near the railroad tracks, its paint peeling, but its heart alive. But here's the truth. The separation birthed something powerful. Black churches in the 1960s weren't just houses of prayer. They were fortresses of community. Inside, people found not just God, but each other. The scent of perfume mixed with wood polish, the hum of the choir swelled like thunder, and for a few hours, you were reminded that your life still had worth. While white America worshipped comfort, black America worshipped survival. Those pews held the first whispers of revolution, the same voices that would march in Montgomery and sing in Selma. Now you can walk into any church you choose. But back then, the black church wasn't just a sanctuary, it was the soul of resistance. Do you remember how every hymn sounded like both a prayer and a promise? Military and war service. You couldn't fight for your country on equal ground. During the Vietnam War and the years before it, black soldiers often faced two battles, one overseas and one the moment they came home. In World War II, segregation in the ranks was official. By the 1960s, it was supposed to be gone, but racism didn't evaporate with policy. It lingered, in promotions denied, in barracks divided, in medals unawarded. You might have worn the same uniform, carried the same rifle, and bled on the same field. But when you returned to your hometown, the same old signs still greeted you. Whites only. Imagine risking your life under a flag that didn't protect you at home. Even on base, there were unwritten rules. White officers gave orders, black soldiers carried them out. Yet, in the face of all that, many still served with pride, because serving meant believing in a version of America that hadn't yet arrived. Today, when we see veterans honored with parades and ceremonies, it's easy to forget that not every hero was welcomed home. Some had to march for equality after marching for their country. Can you imagine the strength it took to salute a nation that refused to salute you back? Closing reflection. So, the next time you sit at a counter, vote at a booth, walk into a hotel, or drink from a fountain, pause for a moment. Remember those who couldn't. Remember the mothers who packed lunches for the road, the fathers who walked miles to vote, the children who sat in classrooms surrounded by hate but refused to quit. Their courage didn't just open doors, it built the floor you stand on. Because the truth is, the 1960s weren't just about what African Americans couldn't do. They were about how they refused to stay that way. Every barrier became a battlefield, every humiliation became history, and every act of defiance became freedom. Now it's your turn to carry their memory forward. If you remember stories from your parents, your grandparents, or your own life, share them. Drop them in the comments so they're never lost to time. Because memory is power, and power, once shared, never fades. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.